Welcome to the third section of my report on the state of Tamilnadu's finances in early March 2017 in anticipation of the budget presentation due later this month. You may recall the first two sections were introductions to those who did not have familiarity with how to analyze a budget or what the state of affairs was up to 6 months ago. In this section, I will talk about the revenue accounts or the current accounts of the government of Tamil Nadu over the last 13 or so years, breaking them down regime by regime. That is the ADMK government that ran the government between 2003 and 2006, that is post the implementation of the Fiscal Responsibility Act, the DMK government that was in place between 6 and 11, the ADMK government that was in place between 11 and 16, and the recently re-elected ADMK government and its plans for this year, as well as the data we got on February 1st showing progress for the first 6 months. As you can see from the slide, in the first 3 years after the FRA was passed, the ADMK government basically ran a flat revenue budget. It was marginally down about 100 crores a year for a total of 317 crores over 3 years, but fairly responsible. The DMK government, on the other hand, ran a surplus of 477 crores a year for all 5-year average for a total of 2,386 crores. This was between 6 and 11. When the ADMK government took back again power 11 to 16, it really ramped up spending way ahead. As I told you, the rate of spending went up far greater than the rate of revenues, and so revenue deficits exploded to 3,400 crores a year for a total over 5 years of 17,000 plus crores. If you thought that was bad, you should look at the projections for this year, which this year alone, according to the budget that was placed on the House table in July, the projected revenue deficit was 15,800 crores. And in fact, the February 1st paper shows that the 6-month deficit was already 13,800 crores for a projected total of over 27,000 crores this year. Now, one of the things one should think about is not just steady state progress, but how one deals with unexpected situations. And here again, we have a beautiful case study for us to analyze. Between 2006 and 11, the first 3 years, if you remember, the global economy was doing well, and so was the economy of India and Tamil Nadu. And during that time, the DMK regime ran a surplus of almost 6.23% a year. 2008-9, the global financial crisis hit, and between 9-10 and 10-11, the DMK government implemented the full 6th pay commission recommendations of several thousand crores of increased pay and salary and pensions. And as a consequence, it ended up having 2 years of revenue deficits of roughly 5.11% a year. On average, though, because it had been doing well before the crisis hit, it still managed a 5-year average of 1.7% revenue surplus. Compare that to the ADMK government of 11 to 16. In the first 3 years, they were running a fairly responsible government. Not great, but almost flat in revenue, not unlike the 2003 to 6 period. However, in 2014-15 and 15-16, this discipline completely was blown out of the water, as I mentioned during my budget speech, and the revenue deficits reached 7.25% a year on average, and so the overall 5-year average turned out to be about 2.56% revenue deficit. Again, the difference that happened in late September 2014, if you remember, was that the former chief minister was convicted in Bangalore at the Sessions Court and went briefly to jail, then came out of bail, then had all kinds of health issues, and basically was not functioning at full capacity between September 2014, which was the fiscal year 14-15, subsequently up to the elections. You can draw your own conclusions what the correlation is between her functional capacity and the government's outcome, but this data tells a very interesting story. And if you think that's bad, you should consider what the budget for this year said, which is a projected revenue deficit already in the budget of 10.7%. Remember, the FRA's target is 0%. This is showing a minus 10% deficit, and the half-year data suggests they will end up at an unheard of 21% revenue deficit if the first 6 months is repeated the second 6 months. How do you end up with such a bad deficit? The first part of having a bad deficit is if your revenues don't grow, as I said earlier. Now you can see in 5 years of the DMK government, whatever number the ADMK government passed off to the DMK in terms of revenue receipts, in 5 years it grew that by over 100%. So for every 1 rupee of revenue receipts as of March 31st, 2006, in March 31st, 2011, that was 2 rupees and 5 paisa. Compare that to the ADMK, and all it grew was 85 paisa, so from 1 rupee to 185. This 20% gap, as you can see, widens. In good years, the DMK did better by about 10%, and in bad years, it did better by another 10%, and so the overall difference was 20%. Just to put that in context, that 20% difference in revenue, if the ADMK had grown its revenue receipts at the same pace as the DMK, it would have resulted in another 14,000 crores of revenue receipts last 15-16 compared to what was actually received. Of course, you have to have a second failure as well, not just the first failure of revenue receipts. The second failure has to be how you spend the money. And again, you can tell that in all other revenue expenditures except interest, the DMK, if it started out getting 1 rupee spent on it as 2006 handoff from the ADMK, by the time it gave back in 2011, it was spending 2 rupees 38 paisa. Massive growth in non-interest spending. Compared to that, the ADMK only grew at about 90 paisa for every rupee. On the other hand, what about spending on interest payments? The DMK government in 5 years only grew interest payments by 60 paisa for every rupee that had been left. Or in other words, it got a payment of roughly 5,000 crores a year in 2006. When it finished 5 years later, it was paying roughly 8,000 and change crores a year. The ADMK government, on the other hand, taking over that 8,000 something crores a year in 2011, by the time it finished 2016, was paying 18,300 plus crores a year in interest. Massive difference in the quality of spending. Think back to the RBI report. What is the difference in quality of spending and what it does to growth? Let me put all of that together in one concluding slide. If you look at a responsible government, it grows the rate of non-interest spending much faster than it grows the rate of interest spending. And on that basis, you look at the DMK in good years, it grew the rate of non-interest or program plus salary plus pension plus maintenance spending 47% faster than interest spending. And in bad years, not so much, but still ended up with 76% difference over 5 years. The ADMK in good years, that is, while this former chief minister was in full capacity, already was growing interest payments 11% faster than non-interest spending on all other programs, benefits, salaries, pensions, and in the course of 5 years ended up at 32% faster growth of interest payments. That is, the quality of government spending deteriorated rapidly in these 5 years. With that, let me conclude this section on revenue management. I hope you have seen the breakdown of not just how regime A and regime B worked, but also how you stay prepared for unintended consequences by making hay while the sun shines, running a responsible government so that should you get a shock, you have the capacity to absorb it, compared to if you're already running flat out with zero margin when you have good times, when you have bad times, and in this case the bad times were not so much economic as they were political or based on an individual's health and ability, you still have serious repercussions. With that, let me conclude section 3. Thank you.